All right, Corey.
Good morning.
It is August 18th, halfway through August, pretty much halfway through vacations in August and some summer. It's been nice, for better or for worse. We had a little bit of a rainy July here in the New England area, but so Corey's joining me today. I know you and Steve talked about goal deployment planning, GDP. Today we're going to talk about add a little more color around GDP, simplify it a little bit more, so we're not coming off like management consultant junkies. About how the GDP is actually kind of an important process for businesses of all sizes, especially businesses that are trying to pivot from being overly reactive, which is usually the norm in small businesses, to a little bit more proactive thinking, maybe even some blue sky thinking on how to close up some of those growth gaps. But so you're joining me this week. Byler is actually Steven's on vacation, which is good. He needed it. Last summer I don't think we really did much. So no. I enjoyed camping. It was awfully hot though.
Hot.
It was like 95, 100 degrees in a tent. I had a lot of fun. So,
it's nice to get out.
Yeah, so today we're going to jump back into GDP, LRP, long-range planning, especially as we're coming into the fall. Not to remind everyone, this has actually been a busy week around economic and geopolitical issues. And I don't want to weigh in on the geopolitical side, but that amazingly fast takedown of the Afghan government and the ushering back of the Taliban era. I'm 45 years old, and September 11th, I always said, COVID is to you and your generation what 9/11, 21 years ago, was to my generation. Yeah, and I was just telling Corey, we're in August 2021, and I feel like at times this is reminiscent of February 2020. This Delta variant, it's the real thing, and whether or not we will have lockdowns, pullbacks, I think this time around we can say people have a long memory, and you're seeing the economic numbers and how quickly, not to sound overly draconian here, but in a matter of 3 weeks, some of the economic pullback we're seeing. And that's crazy, right?
From both sides of the
equation. It was
equation.
like July 4th every weekend for the last 5 months, and you can actually get table service. You can actually sit about. I mean, Corey and I, you and I were in Boston yesterday. We'll talk a little bit about that. And it was actually easy to get service. As a matter of fact, the restaurant was empty. I think at one point we may have been the only ones there, and it was 6 o'clock on a Tuesday.
Yeah, but it's coming from both. I think the economic indicators show that this ripple is coming on both the consumer side of things, but also there's some indicators coming from the corporate side of things for in a different context.
In a different context, I would say there's a lot of things that companies need to be aware of, whether it's producer pricing, whether that's a function of supply chain bottlenecks finally rippling through, coming through the system, or maybe it was a function of amazing consumer demand, right? That we had, that was
Which I think is a big piece of it.
It is, for sure. So you've got producer pricing increasing. That came out this week. Let's talk about the consumer, right? The consumer spending is the largest portion of GDP. And one thing that totally took me by surprise this week was an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal. And I know I dig the WSJ. It was about foot traffic. And, you look at that, and it all started second, third week of July. And they actually stratified out this chart by, I don't know, I think it was like gyms,
restaurants, hotels maybe,
retail. And there was a dramatic decrease year over year. I mean, not year over year, but from 2021 to 2019, if I recall. And when you look at January, February, right up until, say, June, it was all increasing, not year over year, but from 2019.
Yeah.
This is 2019, so we're looking back 2 years. So we're normalizing, if you will, normalizing for COVID. And here we are in the middle of August, and all of a sudden, second, third week of July,
Plummet.
compared to 2019, down 40%. And that was like, wow, first of all, it's pretty cool that you can even like track that, pull this data, right? But obviously that data ended up bearing its presence, if you will, in the consumer, obviously University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index and consumer demand.
I think we're about to see a lot of headwinds, not just from like a lot of that consumer demand and like the foot traffic and stuff dropped right as a result of like the Delta coming out and right the news around that. But I think we're going to see some heavy headwinds with unemployment benefits ending. Let's not forget that ends in what, 2 months, month and a half.
Month and a half.
And when the unemployment line kind of starts to dry up a little bit, how does that impact consumer demand as well, right?
Right. I don't know, man.
Because a lot of the demand over the past 12 months, 18 months, has been a linkage to some of the unemployment benefits, the stimulus checks, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're going to see...
yeah, this is...
the combination all at once is going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I personally got to a point in June, kind of pulled back on going out, tough
There's
service.
There's a novelty up front.
Yeah, totally, right. It's, our new frontline workers, hospitality workers, right, the restaurant. Service was tough. You have a lot of empathy and compassion for that situation, but at some point you're just like, oh, maybe it's just easier for me to cook at home, right?
Yeah.
So you're right, headwinds, consumer demand, consumer sentiment dropping. The only silver lining right now is twofold, I think, right? The vaccine sounds like today, tomorrow, getting an announcement, booster, that's good. And then secondly, it's the amount of cash that corporations are hoarding to the tune of almost $7 trillion. And that's up from
5 trillion, I believe.
5 trillion, maybe 5-6 years ago. So if the corporations, if companies do not start spending this war chest, then yes, you're going to have an inflection point that I'm not sure,
Yeah, and I don't know if they will start spending it, right? I think like it's ironic timing, right, with the GDP, us going into it, but the need to begin planning and scenario planning and understanding the risks versus opportunities that we have ahead. But I think corporations are hoarding cash. We're seeing it with some of our customers. They're hoarding it because they just don't know. And at the end of the day, what's going to get you through this? Having enough cash in the bank.
Yeah. Let's take a look at, let's revisit GDP.
Yep.
That was a good conversation, right? Consumer demand dropping, corporations with a ton of cash. This fits this is great for GDP. This is great for planning, right?
Goal deployment plan.
Yeah, goal deployment planning. It kind of sounds a little fancy, but essentially, I like to look at GDP as, hey, here's what I did last year. And every year, you're updating your 5-year plan. You're looking out 5 years, and it's great. Everybody loves to do that. I want to go from 5 million to 50 million in 5 years. That's great. Show me the roadmap. Show me how you're going to get there.
And not just show me the roadmap as I'm going to double my units sold, right? But how are you going to double those units sold?
Right. How are you going to accelerate marketing and customer acquisition? Conversations, we're having it right now with our own company and other companies. So I like to look at it, forget about the names, the matrix, but I like to look at it, the linkage, right? You start with your long-range plan. So if it is to increase revenue in 5 years by tenfold, that's good. So now what is it that I need to do as a management team next year, tactically, to hit that number? But before you even go to tactically, you're trying to connect your long-range plan with your annual operating plan, because the tactical piece is what happens during the year to hit your annual operating plan goal. So, okay, back to basics. You got your 5-year long-range plan. I want to increase revenue by tenfold. What can I realistically achieve next year to ensure that I'm on that 5-year journey? So maybe it's, I need to double sales next year, or maybe increase revenue by 50%. Now, increasing revenue by 50% is no way going to get you to tenfold in 5 years.
Yep.
But it's
a starting point.
It's a starting point.
Yep.
And then, now that you know that you're going to hit, that your intent is to hit a 50% increase in revenue in your annual operating plan for the following year, that would be in this case 2022. Now we talk about processes, functions, tactics, maybe new things that you're going to try.
Who's going to do it?
Right. So let's talk about how are you going to increase revenue by 50%. So Korey, put your marketing hat on.
Yeah, most of the time people just think, we've seen it a lot with a lot of these things, right? You just increase the units sold, and that's not realistically going to happen, right? So use a realistic number if you're going to grow by 50%. Like, are you really going to grow by 50%, or you're going to grow by 20%? But then if you're going to go there, not just like, I'm going to increase sales, I'm not just going to double my units sold, but what marketing efforts do you have to do? Are you going to start paid ads? Are you going to start cold calling? Are you going to start knocking on doors? Like, whatever it is. Are you going to hire a sales team? Are you going to go into adjacent markets, new product, new service? Like, what is the actual underlying effort?
So let's kind of play that out. I want to increase my revenue by 50%. And yes, my production can accommodate an increase of 50% in widgets. Okay, so all right, good. So we don't need to worry about that next year. Maybe in 2 years we have to worry about that. But what we have to worry about or focus on next year is volume side, like the actual selling. So let's say you're a company and you normally have grown your business through referrals. And now you're saying, well, normally if I grow my business through referrals, historically, I've only done about 10%, 15% increase in revenue. So what other strategies are out there that I can use to hit 50% growth in my revenue? I know we're making numbers up here, but Korey, let's kind of talk about digital marketing. So a company that has never really focused on, they have a website, they got a couple of Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts, but they've really never embraced or made digital marketing a core competency. Yeah. What would you recommend? Two things.
Digital presence.
Number
good. One, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a manufacturer or auto repair shop, visibility at some degree has to play into this. So build a baseline, whether that's setting up a website if you don't have it, whether that's getting on Yelp, whatever, Open Table if you're a restaurant, right? Set that foundation. Make yourself visible so that someone can actually find you.
Okay, so one is the piping, the foundation, the presence. Yeah. Give me a second one. And I want to talk about, I'm trying to get us to talk about customer acquisition, right?
Yeah, I'd probably say the next one, depending on the industry, obviously, would probably be somewhere around content. Whether that's blogs for you, whether that's webinars, whether that's ebooks.
So, in other words, we're moving from a very referral-based sales growth strategy to splitting that between the referral, which is the legacy way, and embracing more digital marketing. Okay, good. So I kind of heard a few things from you. So it sounds like you need a website, you need the piping, you need some social media presence, you need tools. Great. Then the second piece is you need content. You need to start building out content. You need to be able to track that. Okay, so that's great. So now you've got yourself two processes. So if you kind of follow this again, your long-range plan sets a 5-year target for your revenue. Your annual operating plan sets a target for next year. And the process, which is the third piece, connects that, the goal of increasing this by 50%, I'm going to leverage not just referrals, but now I'm going to jump into the world of digital marketing. And here are the two processes I'm using. Perfect. Now, the next piece to this is how do you measure? How do you measure that you're actually achieving these two processes? So let's start with number one. And by the way, you can measure things very binary. It can be, yes, I did it. No, I didn't. That's too easy, right? I like to take a next step and be like, okay, how much traffic did I get, right? So let's talk about two metrics that you can use that have a high correlation of tracking the success of those two processes.
Yeah, I'm going to use two different examples because this can go a million ways hard to put into two. But let's say you are a auto repair shop. Okay. A random example here. One way is not going to be traffic, right? It's not just going to be I got an increase in 10% on my volume to my website, right? It's not really going to do too much for you. But it may be things like 10% off your oil change, right? A coupon, right? Which is a form of content, I would say,
Yep.
right? But how many people actually use that, right? How effective is your digital marketing? Are people actually using this coupon, or did no one use it throughout the course of the year? If no one used it, digital marketing, like that effort, did not translate into new customers.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the second process, which is creating content, a type of content you can create is promotional material, a coupon. So great. So a metric could be what percent of new revenue came from content. In this case, we're using something super simple.
Yep.
Auto repair shop has a content for promotion.
It'd be the same thing for a plumber, for an electrician, right?
Sure.
So a lot of these service-based businesses, right?
Good. So that is a way of tracking whether or not this process of creating content is successful. Let's take it a step up. Let's talk about, bring it back to like us and some of our marketing customers. And again, we're picking our marketing because it's directly related to increasing revenue. At the end of the day, the metric we're trying to measure is, did this process help me achieve my annual operating goal of increasing 50%? So let's look at another. Maybe let's talk about conversions. So digital marketing, content, submission forms. Let's talk about how we can use submission forms as a metric.
Yeah. As a metric, it really is quite simple. Ask your customers, right? It's like, you see this often, right? And there's a reason behind it, obviously. Where'd you find us? How'd you hear about us, right? On the form that you're trying to set up a demo, set up a time to schedule with someone, right? How'd you find out about us, right? That's one way. That's very simple.
Yep.
And that's going to give you probably the most clear answer. However, otherwise, it could be, use your platforms like Google Analytics, Google Search Console, right? Reason why I go down that route is, sure, someone may have submitted a form, right? But what you really want to know is not just, okay, great, they submitted a form, we have one more person, but how'd they get to that form, right? Track the journey. Track the journey,
but I think I still think that the metric needs to be tied back to the annual operating plan goal of increasing sales by 50%. So I think not an interesting metric, but a very simple metric would be, okay, if I'm using forms as part of my process of creating that digital presence, what percentage of new revenue came through form submissions? So maybe the metric is, my goal is to achieve 10% of all new revenue to be generated by form submissions. Yep. Great. So we've gone through long-range plan, annual operating plan, process, keeping it very simple because this can this should be hitting all different parts of your organization.
But I want to take that example just a step further, just for a second here. Let's say you want 10%, or you expect 10% to come through these form submissions. Follow that journey either way, right? Because it will inform you on what you exactly need to do. If you need 10% from form submissions, great. What is your conversion rate once you get that contact, right? Cool. Take that step back. If you need this number of new customers, say it's a 10% conversion, right? I need 10 forms submitted before I get a customer. What is your conversion rate from visits to form submissions? Let's say it's 1%. Great. Now I need 10 form submissions at 1%. I need 1,000 people, right? 1,000 visitors.
So I'm glad you went down there. So you're kind of getting into the weeds. Because if I were creating, so one of the things that come out of the corporate level or company level GDP is functional level GDP. If the function of marketing was directly tied to being responsible for hitting 50% increase in revenue for the annual operating plan, then you could blow that out and create another GDP specifically for marketing. But at a high level, because again, you can't boil the ocean, you can't manage everything, for identifying one or two metrics that you can track to make sure that your process is successful. So the last piece in this, which I think is the most important piece, now once you've understood that the long-range plan is and the annual operating plan, your processes, your metrics, now you need somebody who's going to be the champion, who's going to own this. In other words, who's accountable to making sure that Korey's two suggestions around how to hit 50% increase in revenue, who's going to own that? So in that case, it would be you, right? So you as head of marketing, you own those two processes, and you better make sure that you hit those two metrics, because the beauty of the GDP process is now you can tie that all of this back to pay for performance. Now you've got two metrics that essentially ties back to business strategy, business execution, like the rubber meets the road here, people, right? And now you can start beginning to tie Korey's bonus and comp structure to those two metrics. So that's what I love about GDP.
And I'm glad you went down that route as well, because
You have
held
to.
back.
It always comes back to people.
Well, no, because I held back at the beginning of this conversation, but that's kind of where I peppered in the fact that like these need to be realistic numbers. Because if it's a 200% growth, sure, maybe if you have a small baseline, you're just starting the company, right? It's a tech startup, right? It's one thing, right? But if you've been in business for 10 years, most likely you're not going to grow by 200%. And so if those aren't realistic numbers, then like tying it back to pay for performance, you're not going to get to good sentiment.
So could a company who has historically never exceeded more than 10% revenue growth not be in a position to increase revenue by 50%? Well, yes and no, because this is where I started this conversation. You guys last week talked about GDP. I want to keep it simple, because at the end of the day, GDP flows into your long-range planning, which then flows into your annual operating plan. So if my goal is to hit 50% growth in revenue next year, meaning tenfold growth in revenue over the next 5 years, then as you're building your revenue, your cost of goods sold, your pro forma, right, part of what comes out is, what does it take to actually do it? Because these two very simple examples that you brought out may not need a whole lot of capital. You throw 50 grand at a web dev company, data analytics, at most, and you kind of get it, it's there. But let's say that one of the processes was, we're going to start using Google Ads. Why? Because we understand the CPC, we understand conversions, we understand, but to hit a 50% growth in revenue next year and a tenfold increase in revenue over the next 5 years, I may have to spend upwards of $1 million in Google AdWords.
It's exponential.
It's exponential. And in order to feed that beast, in this case, is you need capital. And if you're a free cash flow flywheel, I usually call it, right? If it's not throwing out enough capital to feed the beast, then you need to go out and find liquidity elsewhere. That is, in essence, the purpose of the long-range plan. What are my goals? What do I want to hit in the next 5 years? What do I need to do next year? What resources? And I don't care if it's people, machinery, footprint. I don't care what type of resource, because at the end of the day, the long-range plan will end up telling you how much cash this plan needs to hit its goals.
But that's the exact reason why we need to go down this as well and focus on taking the exercise to actually figure out some of those customer acquisition costs, right? Even if it's at a high level, because that formula can get very complex very quickly, right? But even at a high level, because let's take ourselves for example, right? Like our customer acquisition cost for say email marketing is lower than what it would be for Google Ads, right?
Correct.
But the reason why we're willing to take that higher customer acquisition cost is because one of them is scalable, right?
Correct.
And so it's not always down to the lowest common denominator of what's my cheapest way to acquire a customer, because that may get tapped, right?
But then in your long-range plan, you can adjust what percentage of new customers come from, in this case, email campaigns versus Google AdWords.
Exactly.
Because I may not produce enough free cash flow this year to actually juice up the Google AdWords. Now, we're using very simple models here, but the reality is in a lot of these e-commerce and SaaS-based businesses, it really just comes down to those 2 or 3 very, very simple marketing drivers. Now, companies, manufacturing companies, distribution companies, they're very different, right? There's other pieces, salespeople, but it's all relevant, right?
Yeah.
So let's take an old school business. Old school business wants to, say, double revenue by twofold, so something more conservative over the next 5 years, which means you need to maybe hit 15% growth next year if you just do it linear. But in order to hit 15% growth, I may need to go out and hire a new salesperson, and then another new salesperson, and so on and so forth, right? If I'm not in a recurring business and I'm in a transactional business, you need capital for that. You need capital, and you also need to be able to understand the break-even cash flow, in that inflection point on hiring a new salesperson. That information, that's why we build long-range plans, right? Yeah. Because a long-range plan helps us understand that our goals, whatever they are, it may require capital to acquire, hire, buy.
And maybe you can't afford that sales development, that sales rep individual this year.
But you could go get a loan somewhere.
You could get a loan, or maybe you take maybe you take that cold email, I'm using this as an example, right? But that cold email approach of setting the foundation to build you up so next year you have that exponential growth by being able to afford the sales individual.
I tell customers and companies, like, you don't adjust the plan. You're not supposed to adjust the plan based on the realities of the business. Like, you're supposed to manage the business to the plan. And that's why you come up with your goal deployment plan, because
the plan is the plan.
That's the goals, right? Those are my long range. That's where I want to be in 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And like, if you want to graduate from college in 4 years, and that's my goal, then you're going to work your tail off, and you're going to study, and you're going to do X, Y, and Z to make sure you hit. You don't actually turn around and be like, sorry, provost, chancellor, I can't actually do it in 4 years. It needs to be in 6 years because, I really didn't study here, So the
you don't
plan,
say that on the fourth
this
year,
plan
too.
of like 4-year plan, it's not for me, sorry. You don't do that, right? You adjust your behavior, you adjust your management style to hit your goals, your targets, your plan.
I want to bring some clarification to that, because we talked about the updated annual operating plan, right? Something that we'll do mid-year. That's not for the purpose of adjusting the plan based on what you've actually done necessarily, but more so influenced by what happened over those first 5-6 months that may require you to take a different approach to close the gap.
Correct. Yep. Do I need to pull back? Do I need to hire more sales reps? Do I need to hire, right?
You started the AOP in December of 2019. You reapproach it summer of 2020. You didn't realize COVID was going to hit, right? That's why you adjust it, not because you didn't.
Yeah. So I'm going to I want to go back to the GDP, because I want to use a different example, because using revenues, in the digital marketing world it's easy, right? And it's hard for mainline type businesses to understand, because CAC, CPC, all that stuff, like, most people don't get conversions and stuff. So let's talk about a service-based business. It's something we can all relate to. And your revenue, you ask yourself, okay, what are the drivers of revenue? So let's say my goal for my service-based business is to increase revenue by 15% in the next 5 years, which means I need to hit about 5% next year. But what I noticed was my gross margins in the prior 2 years really haven't been hitting that world-class sort of 65% gross margins. To be exact, it should be a third, but whatever. And you notice that your gross margins have been like more around 50. And you have to ask yourself, is that a revenue problem? Is it a production problem? Part of this goal deployment planning doesn't have to be just about top-line growth. It could also be like, hey, over the next 5 years, my goal is to get gross margins back up to world-class levels of 65%, which means I need to close a 15% gap, which is pretty damn long, because if you back into those numbers, a company that's $1 million, you're looking at $150,000 in lost
expenses,
profit, right?
Yeah.
Where's the profit? And so as you're thinking about that, and this happens a lot with many companies, you look at your revenue for service-based businesses, it really comes down to the cost of people. Yeah, there's other noise in there, reimbursables and all that. But at the end of the day, it's that 30% of revenue that you're spending, or 40%, or in this case 50%, is probably all cost of labor. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, and knowing that your revenue, so where is your revenue, what are the drivers of your revenue? Well, it's pricing, right? If you're leaving money on the table, maybe there's some opportunity there. It could also be lack of productivity, right? Maybe you have a nice backlog and people, you have the customer demand, but your production team is not being managed tightly. So let's go through this process again. My long-range plan is to increase margins back up to 65%. Therefore, next year, maybe my goal is, let's just move the needle to 5%. Or maybe even 3%. Why not go all the way? Well, because maybe the process that you're going to sign up for in order to hit a 3 to 5% margin expansion in your AOP and a 15% margin expansion in your LRP may actually require you to hire somebody maybe $150,000, $200,000 a year. Well, if you do that, guess what? Your margins are going to come, they're going back the other way.
Yeah.
But why would you do that? Because maybe production just needs to be tightly managed, which may require, some hiring, some firing, and even some new technology, tracking systems, data analytics, business intelligence.
The cloud.
So it takes time, when you lose ground in your gross margins, it actually takes a lot longer to get them back to where they need to be. But there you go. Now you have a process. My process is I'm going to hire a VP of production. And another process is I'm going to build out dashboards based on the business intelligence as pulling data from everywhere. And so now I can come up with some results. Did I hire this person? Yes or no? So you can keep that binary. Maybe another metric is my gross margin actually increasing? Am I seeing that? Okay, great. And now you can actually begin to assign people to be accountable for that. Maybe it's the new person that you hire that's accountable for the dashboard, and maybe it's the CEO who's accountable for hiring that new individual. There you go. We've just created, like on the cost of goods sold side, we've created a path to go from your long-range plan, annual operating plan, processes, metrics, who's accountable, and oh, by the way, all of that goes right into your long-range plan. How can it not, right?
Yeah. And I think your point there is also sometimes you need to take a step back before you take 2 steps forward. Like it doesn't always have to be growth, because there is a such thing as growth.
Well, anytime you invest in anything in businesses, you're taking 2 steps back. Investments are, we're not talking like capital investments here. We're talking free cash flow investments. So anytime you hire somebody, your margins are going to take a hit, right? But why do you do it? Because there's opportunity. So that's like the quick and dirty raw take on the importance of GDP. I love doing GDP in the middle of August.
Timely right now.
Timely. People have taken some time off. I love, the months of July and August. It's all, we've been doing even a lot of blue skying here around developing Salesforce and BDOs and how to begin to bring that into our business. Since we've been very successful on the marketing side and lead generation and even conversions, but sometimes these leads kind of fall through the cracks. So, to our conversation yesterday, if we're going to dump X amount of money into Google AdWords and you're going to generate, hundreds and hundreds of leads, you do need solid BDO type individuals to lock those appointments down. So, love July and August, blue sky thinking. GDP really makes you memorialize and create a workflow to ground and make actual people, management teams, accountable. And then obviously come September, we should all be thinking about our long-range plans. Yeah,
and we're going to include a template for the goal deployment plan / hosting matrix in the show notes. So check that out if you want a template, starting point.
Cool. Well, this is fun. Cool. It's a topic I enjoy. I don't like to present and talk about it like management consultants, right?
It's about decision making.
Right. You got to keep these things simple.
Yeah.
Because I do believe that GDP, LRP, AOP, all these acronyms, it really forces companies or helps companies become less reactive and more proactive with their planning. Otherwise, all I'm doing is putting numbers on a paper, and then 6 months later, I'm be like, the budget's always wrong. The budget's always wrong. Why do we even do a budget? It's always wrong. Well, it's always wrong because we're not planning to it, right? We're not. So, a big shout out to our marketing team, Allison, John, Emlyn, and Corey. I know this is kind of at the end of the show, but we were in Boston yesterday with one of our big marketing customers. A lot of fun. You actually got to be in the big board meeting. They actually didn't even invite me in. They kept me in the corner.
They did. I told them not to.
Yeah, I'm good with that. One of the things I've enjoyed over the last 5-7 years is when I actually get disinvited to customer meetings because managers, analysts have built and developed that relationship, and the customer has that confidence. Because this is the strategy we play here. It's all about human leverage, people leverage. Otherwise, you can't grow. So, anyways, looking forward to having Steve next week. We actually have a special guest next week. He's become a good friend of our company. His name is Blake Oliver. Outside of being a tremendous human being, he's also a great influencer in the 21st century cloud accounting, finance as a service, they call it consulting advisory service, CAS, right?
Yes, yep.
And of course, he works for Giraffe, who's
One of our close partners.
one of our close partners and an important component in our own tech stack. So I'm excited to have Blake because the topic for next week is going to be around the paradigm shift. It's like the seismic paradigm shift that has happened in our accounting professional services industry with a main focus on marketing. So some of the things Korey was talking about, how business development, the shift has been for service-based businesses to focus on the branding and not the partners. And Korey, 7 years ago when we met, we were always focused on, hey, this can't be about Dan. This can't be about Dan and Steven. This has to be about the company, because that's how you create not just value for your customers and value for management teams, but also creates value for young talent in joining us. So excited to have Blake on.
Yeah, I think it'll be instrumental, inspiring. So listen in next week. We'll be live next Wednesday as well. Take a look back at last week's podcast as well. Talked a little bit more about a little bit different perspective on the goal deployment plan with Steven. So give it a view and let us know what you think.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Cool.
Nice job, Korey.
Thanks, everyone.